Bond sign-ups are out there in the foyer. There's a table set up out there. If you haven't signed up for a Common Bond group yet, we hope that you'll go out there. There's Common Bond groups in all the areas. So different groups. We hope that you'll find a group and meet with them. If you have questions about any of the specific groups, you can talk to me or one of the elders, and we can kind of point you to who you need to talk to or whatever else like that. So I would encourage you to get involved with a Common Bond group. Donations for Clinica de Esperanza. Tonight is the last night to drop off donations because they'll be taking them over to SunQuest tomorrow or Friday. When are they going? Friday. Okay, they're going on Friday. To give to Gail, and then Gail will take care of them. So vitamins, yeah, all that stuff. Just no gummies. No gummies. That's the only thing I remember out of the whole thing. So, and that's all the announcements that I have. So, without further ado, as we say, our speaker tonight is Bruce Dougherty, born Warren, Ohio. Oh, a very good year. Married his wife in Fayetteville, Georgia, in 1981. That was also a good year. And they have two sons, Mike and Vince. They also have 6 grandchildren. I think we've got you beat. Bruce received his BA in Bible from Freed-Hardeman College in 1981. He received his MA in Church History from Harding Graduate School of Religion in 2006. He preached at Bevel Road Church of Christ from 1990 to 2000 before moving to Ohio, and he returned to Bevel Road and has been their minister since 2011. Taught the Florida School of Preaching and the West Virginia School of Preaching. So without further, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce and let him tell you.
It's a real pleasure for me to be with you, and I'm always grateful for the invitation that is extended to be a part of your summer series. It's great to work together with congregations in the area, and again, in the little book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul encourages us to maintain the unity of the Spirit with the bond of peace, and so we are glad for these occasions that we can meet together. I trust that you've had a blessed summer series for this year, and I know there have probably been a lot of other great speakers that you've had. I'm just one filling in and closing everything out, and so I thank you for the opportunity to be here. In the assignment that was given to me and the choice that I made a long time ago was the idea of bringing a message from the book of 1 Peter. And so in our lesson tonight and what we want to do, we're going to just review a little. You are all acquainted, I'm sure, with 1 Peter, and you know this good section of the scriptures, but we'll do a little review to talk about 1 Peter. Then we're going to bring and just share a message that comes from part of this good book. Introduction to 1 Peter. If we would just kind of subtitle it, I've called it Faith Under Trials. The word trials or testing or suffering is found some 16 times in 5 little chapters. And so that word frequency tells us that there's probably a lot going on with suffering and the idea of Christians being ready for suffering. And we'll talk some more about some things that may be developed in the late 1st century, but also things that extended into the 2nd century for this particular region where Christians were prevalent as Peter wrote to them. Now, we know the author, right? We're very familiar with Peter. Maybe we don't need much to have to say a lot about Peter, but Peter is one who traveled what I call the low road and the high road, right? We think about some high roads in Peter's life. Can you tell me a few things about Peter? Some of his highs that he experienced? He walked on water, yeah. He's only one of the others that did that, so that's a big thing. Yes, sir. He's one of the three that are there on that mountain when Jesus is revealed in his glory. Again, in the book of 2 Peter, Peter will make mention of that because he says this faith that he had was not a fable when he saw the glory of Jesus revealed there on that mountain. What else about the high roads of Peter do you remember? All right, Matthew chapter 16. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's the high point there in that confession that Peter makes. And it is a confession where still Peter doesn't know everything about all of those things that he's said. Sometimes, we can say something up here before we really have it translated down to our heart. But that's what Peter did. One of the things that always is remarkable to me is every time you find a list of the 12, Peter's name is always first. And of course, our Roman Catholic neighbors have made too much out of Peter. Going back to that passage in Matthew 16, 18, where Jesus promises to build his church, they have kind of construed this to say that Peter was the rock that Jesus was referring to. But Peter tells us here, even in 1 Peter, that we come to him, the living stone, and we are stones built up on him. And so Peter, while we acknowledge him being first, while he had many high points in his life, I don't think he was the rock that Jesus was mentioning there. The bedrock confession was Jesus was the Christ, and that's what the church is founded on. All right. Now, we also know Peter traveled some low roads. All right. What are some of the low roads that Peter traveled? You remember any? Yes. The night of the betrayal. To say and deny Jesus those 3 times. Every bit as much of a betrayal as what Judas did. And so very serious. What else brings us to the low road with Peter?
Well, he went back to eating with the Jews and avoiding the Gentiles.
All right, Galatians chapter 2. The Apostle Paul talks about Peter. Notwithstanding that Peter preached the first sermon at Pentecost, and he also led to the conversion of the first Gentile that we know about in the household of Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, it seems like he goes back to where, his upbringing in the Jewish community had him isolated from brethren in the Gentile community. And Paul said he was carried away with hypocrisy. And the Apostle Paul said, I withstood him to the face in front of everybody. You like to be confronted? I don't like it even in private. And then to imagine in a church assembly, here you're being confronted like that. But it was where Peter also traveled that low road. We also know, you mentioned about him walking on the water. What happened when Peter walked on the water? He started to sink. Yeah, he took his eyes off of Jesus and he's looking at the clouds. He's looking at the waves. He's looking at everything. And I'm sure he's thinking, what in the world am I doing out here? And so he started to sink. And so that was, I think, a low point. And there in Matthew 16 as well, after that great confession, then Jesus said, guess what? We're going to go up to Jerusalem. We're going to, the Son of Man's going to be betrayed into the hands of the Gentiles, and they're going to crucify him, and he's going to rise the 3rd day. But all Peter has heard is, Son of Man is going to be crucified. And so Peter says, Lord, that's not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen. And you remember that Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. You're mindful of the things of men, but you're not mindful of the things of God. And of course, Peter has a different concept of the Messiah at that point. He doesn't know about the suffering Messiah. He doesn't know about the glorious resurrection. And so he has that point of traveling on the low road as well. And so we see highs and lows in the life of Peter. But you know what? I'm glad the Bible has both of those for me. I think I tend to identify with a guy like Peter more readily than I identify with a guy like Paul. Paul seems to me to be, he's the giant. He's the man who does all these things, establishes all these churches, goes to all these places, endures so much. And it seems like Paul is just almost superhuman. Whereas when I see Peter, I see, boy, that's a guy like Bruce. Bruce can be pretty rash and pretty brash and sometimes speaking up when he should be silent and all those kind of things. And there's times when Bruce falls flat on his face. And so when I read about these things about Peter in Scripture, I say, there's a guy like me. And if a guy like me is writing a letter to me or to the church where I would be assembled, I think I'd want to find out what Peter would have to say for me. Now, that's Peter, the author. Let's talk about the recipients of his message. All right, he writes to scattered Christians. He tells us in 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. All right, and these are provinces that are in what we today know as modern-day Turkey. They're the northern, I did wrong here. I'm not sure I can, all right, maybe you can see it a little bit here. All right, over here is, again, Israel, and Peter is writing to Christians in this area, Pontus, Cappadocia, Galatia, Bithynia, and Asia. All right, this is the area, he calls them the dispersion. And this is a technical word that was used to describe the Jewish people that had been scattered after the various, different deportations of Jews following the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, then the different things that had gone after that. A lot of Jews scattered throughout the Mediterranean world. And so Peter is writing to a particular segment of these folks in the sharing of this message. And so they are probably a lot of Christians from a Jewish background, but because they're in Gentile territory, there are also probably a number of Gentile Christians as well. And so Peter is writing to these folks, but he is telling us about Christians under trial as we think about maybe in the early 60s, the midpoint or just past the midpoint of the first century. Notice in chapter 1 and verse 6, Peter talks about, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials. And then in chapter 2 and verse 1, Peter will make reference to the folks as having to lay aside malice and deceit and hypocrisy and evil speaking. And sometimes when people are opposing us, we can kind of respond in the same way, can't we? And so Peter is urging these Christians not to set aside those things. He also tells us in chapter 2 and verse 11, Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. So there are spiritual battles these folks are fighting. There are also external trials that they are going to. And Peter makes a special mention here in 1 Peter 2:13 about submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors. Sometimes Christians can be tempted to say, well, I don't have to obey the law of this land because that guy's corrupt, or these officials are corrupt, or these laws are terrible laws. Brethren, God didn't give us that option. And Peter is reminding those Christians they did not have that option as well. And then, of course, in chapter 4, we're very familiar with the passage where Peter says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter." And so Peter is writing to Christians under trial. It's interesting to note, in the introduction, it was mentioned that I've got a advanced degree in church history. There's a great 2nd century letter that's written by the Roman governor of this region. His name is Pliny. He's known in history as Pliny the Younger. And he's writing about the year 115 AD. So that's early 2nd century from this same region. And Pliny has a problem. And so he's writing to the Emperor Trajan. He says, "I need some help with this problem." And his problem is, I've rounded up a whole bunch of people who are Christians. And Pliny says, "I've never been present at a trial of Christians before. And so, gracious Emperor Trajan, would you help me to know what to do with these folks?" And then he lists the crimes of these folks. He talks about how they don't steal, they don't commit crimes, but they meet kind of secretly. They meet so that they can promise to each other, "We're not going to be evil people today. We're going to be faithful to the Lord." They alternately, he says, sing hymns in a alternating chorus to Jesus as King. And so Pliny can't understand it. He's an outsider looking on these folks, but describing these folks. He knows a lot about them. He talks about how these Christians meet together. They'll come back and take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. I would imagine that grape juice and fruit and unleavened bread is pretty ordinary, pretty harmless kind of food. And not understanding, again, that they're not participating in some kind of meal to feed the body, but they're remembering Jesus in that meal. And so he tells us a lot about these things. He also tells us that there are so many Christians in these regions over which he's governing that the pagan temples have been closed down or nearly closed down for 20-some years. And that the meat markets have also been closed down as a result, because you're not offering sacrificial victims, cows and goats and all the other kind of things that the pagans offered in their worship, just like Jews offered in the temple. And so the meat markets were people that took the portions of the meat that was not offered, but they would sell it, and we know what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians about eating meat sacrificed to idols and all these kind of things. But it's interesting, in Pliny's letter, he is telling us not only have the temples been kind of nearly abandoned, but it's also where the meat markets have been nearly shut down. But as a result of Pliny's coming to the rescue and making a lot of threats and other kind of things and rounding up all these Christians, now those places seem to be flourishing again. But it tells us the impact of Christianity. And Pliny also writes in this letter, he says, I don't know what to do with these folks. If maybe they've renounced Jesus once, should I let them go? Or if they've made their commitment to Christ, that I should punish them anyway, whether they want to relent or not. He says also there's Christians of every age, male and female, boys and girls, urban people, people in the countryside. And it just tells you, again, the impact of Christianity by 115. He also mentions in this about how he has set up a bust of Nero. And when these Christians come in for their trials, if these Christians are willing to take a pinch of incense and sprinkle it on the altar before Nero and say, Nero is king, or Caesar is king, not Nero, but Caesar is king, then he'll let them off. But he says true Christians will never do that. And so these are the people he's rounded up. And of course, he's also got Roman citizens who are involved in this. Now, he can't do anything against a Roman citizen. They have to be sent to Caesar, to Trajan in Rome for their trial. But his letter is an interesting letter as it tells us the impact of Christianity in the early 2nd century in this region of the world. It tells us also that the persecutions that Peter was writing to those Christians who were undergoing a fiery trial there in the 1st century, this has continued into the 2nd century. And so it's very interesting to see this message that is written to these scattered Christians long ago. Now, one more thing. Let's do a little brief outline of 1 Peter. I'm not sure where I got this outline from a long time ago, but to me, it seems to be a very good outline. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 12, Peter tells us that he's written this letter by Silvanus, our faithful brother as I consider him. I've written to you briefly, all right, it's a very small letter, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God in which you stand. And so by Peter's own words, Peter says, I'm writing and sharing with you testimony and exhortation. And we would maybe think of this maybe as applied doctrine. He's not really just laying out doctrine in general. These Christians know these things. But he is talking about the doctrines that will stabilize and encourage these Christians and be something that they need in the face of the trials that they're going through. And so if you look at the way this outline is, it has where Peter offers a testimony. No, he's the eyewitness. He's seen all these things from Jesus and from the beginning of the church. So he's giving his testimony. And those are the more of the doctrinal passages. And then he builds on that, making an exhortation or an encouragement. And so we could call this book Applied Doctrine, really. And he gives a testimony about the heavenly inheritance in chapter 1. That's followed by an exhortation to holy living. He talks about a testimony about God's temple in chapter 2. And then that's followed by honorable conduct among the relationships that these Christians have with outsiders as well as insiders. Then he's talking about the suffering and the sovereignty of Jesus. And as an eyewitness who saw all these things, it I'm sure made an impact as he shared this. And then he concludes by giving an exhortation to leaders and followers in the church. So a little way to organize this letter for us. Now, we're not going to be able to look at everything in 1 Peter, but I do want to share one lesson with you that I think we can all relate to and we can all benefit from. All right. Have any of you ever been to a lawyer's office for the reading of a will? All right, I see a few people have. I never have. That's a totally different experience, and based on what my parents have, I probably won't ever go for a reading of the will with anything in the future because we come from very humble circumstances. But I've seen in the movies some of these times where a will is being read. I'm thinking right now of the movie Gran Torino. Have any of you seen that Clint Eastwood movie? Kind of a different movie from Mr. Eastwood's style. But at the end of this movie, after he has died, they're reading his will, and his sons are there and their family, and he's got this wonderful car. And the sons are expecting that everything will be going to them. He's got a granddaughter there that she thinks she's going to receive this wonderful car that he has, the Gran Torino. And over in the corner is a foreigner. And in the movie, Eastwood is having a lot of trouble because He's living in a section of Detroit that has changed through immigration over the century, not over the centuries, but through the years. And now this Hmong is part of the Vietnamese community that was brought here after the Vietnam War. He is there. And Eastwood leaves his property, his home, to the church he was raised in, or his wife was raised in. And then he leaves that car to that Vietnamese immigrant. And the family is all shocked. We're going to contest this. And they're all angry and things like this. And the movie closes with that young man driving that Gran Torino on the road. Kind of a neat thing if you're a car lover, and kind of a neat thing if you've never seen a will happen or the reading of a will. Shock, surprise, things totally turned on its head. Now, let me tell you about another will. There's a lady who was raised in very humble circumstances in Brooklyn, New York, yet her father encouraged her to go and get a law degree, and she did, and it was a great sacrifice for the family. Now, this is pre-World War I when she's receiving her education, so put it in that time frame. With her law degree, she never practiced law, though she had passed the bar in Washington, D.C., but she became a IRS person who read tax returns. Did not have a very big income. I think in that time is like $3,500 per year. So pretty humble circumstances. This lady never married, lived singly, lived very frugally on her annual salary of $3,500. She never read a paper except when she would go to a library where she could read the paper for free, and never bought more than one coat that she wore through the years. Very, very frugal living. But because she read the tax returns of some very wealthy people, she learned how to invest money. And she took a $5,000 nest egg that she had and invested that. She probably hit right on every investment she made they estimate 96% of the time. When she passed away in 1948, she had a $22 million amount of money. And she had a will. She left it to a Jewish university. She was from Jewish background, but left it to a Jewish woman's university in New York City. She had never visited that university, did not know a single person there, had no ties. And when her will was read and those people, the representatives from that university were there, they were just dumbfounded in surprise at this $22 million gift that they had no expectation about. Now, I say all that to say this. Though I've never been at the reading of a will in a lawyer's office, folks, we're present at the reading of the will of Jesus every time we assemble and when the scriptures are opened. Let's read a passage here in 1 Peter chapter 1, starting with verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance, there's our word that we're going to look at, to an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, you who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, You have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen, you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing, you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Brethren, there's an inheritance. And there is a tremendous description of this inheritance for us. Inheritance. Who is an inheritance for normally? The children. That's right. And so here's Jesus, the one who has left us his testament. You remember again in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 9, the Bible tells us about what goes in effect after the death of the testator. Where there is a testament, there must also be of necessity the death of the testator. For a testament is in force after men are dead, since it has no power at all while the testator lives. Jesus has died. The testament is now in force. And so Peter is talking about this inheritance that is given for those who are the heirs. In Galatians chapter 3 and verse 26, the Bible says that we are all sons of God, or children of God, to accommodate in gender-neutral idea. We are all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus, having been born again and having put on Christ through the baptism that we've experienced. And so, brethren, there is where you and I, because of what we've experienced in submitting faith to the grace of God, we have been born again. We have been made heirs, children of God. And it is this expression here that we understand as we have put on Christ Jesus in baptism, then that we have been made heirs. And Paul will go on to talk about in that context. Let's turn there real quickly. Galatians chapter 4. The Apostle Paul says in Galatians 4 and verse 1, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is master of all. But he's under guardians and stewards until the appointed time by the Father. Even so, when we were children, we were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons." The adoption as sons. That's a tremendous thing to think about, adoption. And people who love these children and want to make them their own and part of their own family. And God looks at you and me. And God says, through my Son Jesus, I want to adopt you. I want to bring you into my family. And so Paul says, "And because you are sons, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ." And so this is what Peter is intending here in 1 Peter chapter 1 when he talks about heirs and the inheritance. He's helping us to know that we have been adopted into the family of Jesus. We have received his Spirit that helps us in our prayers, as Paul says in Romans chapter 8, and it helps us in so many other ways in the life of the Christian. And so what a great thing to know that there is an inheritance for the children of God. Now, let's take a closer look at the people who are gathered for the reading of this will there in Pontus and Bithynia and all these other places there. All right? First of all, we know that they are pilgrims. What's a pilgrim? All right, this world's not my home, just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. All right, pilgrims. There's other ways to talk about pilgrims. Some of the terms are sojourners. Can you think of some memorable pilgrims and sojourners that the Bible tells us about? What's that? Abraham, yes. He was a nomad, and the Hebrew writer in Hebrews 11 talks about how Abraham journeyed because there was no lasting city for him here. He looked for that city whose builder and maker is God. And so that's the term we use for sojourners and pilgrims, and it's used twice here, 1 Peter 1:1 and 1 Peter 2 and verse 11. Let me shed a little more light on ways sometimes we look at pilgrims. When I did ministry over in Italy many years ago, there's a group of folks that they called the Zingari in Italian, and that kind of, the Zingari meant kind of like the gypsies. They always travel about in, we would call RVs. They had no permanent place that they lived in Italy. And the reputation of the Zingari, as they would travel, we'll be here for a few weeks and then we'll move on a little bit and we'll move there. And, as they moved around like that, the reputation in Italy of Zingari is you don't want these folks around too much. Tools you might have will suddenly be disappeared, or other kind of things. And the Zingari always got blamed for any kind of petty theft or other kind of thing that was going on. Perhaps they earned their reputation, but all right, in other places they're considered like that. And so in one sense, if we knew Father Abraham is pitching in his tent out on my lawn, well, welcome. But if it's one of these Zingari, do I want to have him this close to my place, my residence? See, we need to think about it in this light, folks. For the average person who lived in Roman society, and watch these Christians over here, think again of Pliny as he's looking on from the outside toward these Christians. He's not thinking this is Father Abraham and the great patriarchs. He's thinking they're more of these nomad folks and mistrusted. They're thieves. They're con artists. We don't need them around. Let's notice some other people that are here. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. Now, this translation in our English has kind of softened this up. It says servants. The word in the original language really means bondslaves. These are folks, for various reasons, are now in slavery. And again, we tend to think, man, I want some of the higher class folks around. But slaves, nobodies. Sometimes we can look at ourselves, and maybe you look in the mirror and say, I'm a nobody. And we need to remember God had a plan to include all humanity, including the nobodies. And that Jesus' mission when he came was to poor and outcast people. And the Apostle Paul would remind the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 26, you see our calling, brethren, not many wise, not many noble, not many powerful, a bunch of nobodies. And so again, here is this group. Then we look at 1 Peter 3 and verse 1. Wives, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. There's women present at the reading of this will. Guess what? Jewish society rarely ever had women to be present at the reading of a will because they were not included, usually as heirs. This is why when Naomi comes home, in the Old Testament book of Ruth, Naomi comes home, she's got no property there. Now, there was property before she and her husband and her sons left, but when she comes back, because she doesn't have a husband, because she doesn't have sons, she has nothing. All right? In fact, the only time that you read about daughters being given an inheritance is in the book of Numbers, Numbers chapter 27, where a father by the name of Zelophehad, he had 5 daughters. He didn't have any sons. And they petitioned Moses, and Moses took it to the Lord. And the Lord said, what these women have said is right. And so they should receive an inheritance. And later on in Joshua 17, Joshua is making sure that those 5 daughters are receiving their inheritance. But that is the only time you read of women in an inheritance situation in the Bible. Not many wise, not many mighty, not many noble, but these are the folks gathered for this reading. Zingari, slaves, women, and this is the assembly. And so, brethren, don't let somebody say you're a nobody and you don't have a part here. One of the terrible things that happened after the opening up of Russia and the transparency time that they went through was these folks had a lot of light shed on what happened during the reign under Stalin. Millions of his own people put to death, but not only just put to death, they took their records and X'd them out and blotted them out as if these people never even lived. And one of the things that people there have been trying to do is to recover so that they can have an understanding of how enormous was this man's crime. But he was trying to say, I'm wiping it all out. They're all nobodies and nobody will ever know because all their records have been destroyed. Folks, we need to understand when somebody's trying to ease us out and X us out, God is still looking at you and me and saying, they're not nobodies. They're my children. They receive the inheritance. Now, let's break down this inheritance a little bit here for us and see the nature of this inheritance. In 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4, Peter says it is an inheritance incorruptible, undefiled, doesn't fade away, reserved in heaven for you. Now, this inheritance is still to come. It's not a tangible thing here on earth. You remember what happened when the beggar was asking Peter for some alms there in Acts chapter 3? What did Peter and John say? I don't have silver. I don't have gold. The inheritance we're talking about, brethren, is not about silver and gold, earthly treasures. We need to get that right in our minds. And this is important because sadly, a lot of the folks that come knocking on my door down at Bevel Road, they're wanting silver and gold. I like to help folks when I can. I've tried to do that, but I wish they would ask me for the real treasure. I wish they would let me tell them about the real treasure. I wish they would let me share with them, I've got something greater than silver and gold here. And yes, as far and down and out as you are in this moment, there is something that God has prepared for us that far surpasses any of the things that we could think about. And so we need to help people to see this great inheritance, and we ought to act and compose ourselves like we have a great inheritance. It is said about James A. Harding, who was a great preacher of another time, that he would always dress his finest, even when he would go out and cut the grass with those old, you remember those old rotor new invention lawnmowers? But he would do that in his finest. And people would ask him, Brother Harding, why are you doing this? And he said, because I'm a child of the King. And he was going to be dressed like a child of the King all the time. I don't know if you have to do that. We don't have to do that. But rather, we ought to act like we're children of the King rather than children of the paupers. And I think sometimes we can beat up ourselves or beat up other folks and forget I'm a child of the King. It makes you stand up a little straighter. Maybe keeps a smile on your face even when you're going through a lot of difficult things. And so here's our inheritance. Peter says it is about the abundant mercy that God has given to us in 1 Peter 1:3. Mercy is where I deserve to be punished, but God says, no, withhold it. And here's what He in love has given to me, that I can be this recipient of a living hope. There's a lot of people who wish for things in the world. My wife used to work up in Ohio at a Hallmark shop, and there was a well-known denominational preacher who would come in there and he would buy lottery tickets in the Hallmark shop. Well, actually, he would get lottery tickets from another store, but he would tell the ladies in the Hallmark shop, I've got this money, but I'm going to go and buy these lottery tickets. But he says, this is how I spell hope. And you're supposed to be a preacher, believer in God, directing other people's souls to God, and you're wishing on a lottery ticket? How sad. And folks, we need to help people to understand our life in Jesus is not just mere wishful living. I hope there's a heaven. I hope we can know with assurance and certainty. And that's what Peter is telling us here. And so if we can know this and we're assured of this, we need to live it every day before people who need to know about this same inheritance. We also need to help people to understand that this inheritance that's incorruptible, no corruption, moth and rust do not corrupt. I bought a grill this summer, and I was starting to work with this grill and using a thing that I've never done before, because I haven't had a gas grill. I've always had a charcoal grill. But I bought this grill because it could do 3-in-1, and one of the things, it's got one of those big griddles on it. Now, my griddle right now is covered in rust, because I didn't know how to take care of that griddle after I used it one time. And so the rust is corrupting there. And I've got to have a way to scourge all that out so that I could use it. And here we're coming up to a great big weekend, and I'd rather have that griddle working now instead of just rusting out where it is. All right. All right. You folks tell me about it later and straighten me out here. All right. But it's incorruptible. It is undefiled. It doesn't fade away. And folks, that's the kind of thing that we can have as solid in our lives. Notice Peter also says, you who are kept, verse 5, by the power of God through faith for salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. This word kept here means God has kept us and is keeping on keeping us. That's pretty good security, isn't it? Don't have to worry about an alarm system. Don't have to worry about a camera system and all these other kind of things. I'm kept by God. And that sounds pretty good to me. And then Peter says here, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you have been grieved by various trials. There can be joy in the Christian in the midst of trials. And we need to keep that in mind too, because that's part of what it means to be one who inherits. That I can still be joyful. That doesn't mean in this moment that is sad and sorrowful and other kind of things happening that I'm being foolish and flippant. But it helps me to understand that even in the tears and tiredness that we might be going through, we can still have great joy in what God is doing for us. Old-time preacher, another old-time preacher from the Restoration Movement said one time, "Though often weary in my work, I was never weary of it." And I like that expression. He's acknowledging he got tired, that he faced the weariness, but he said, that's the work I want. That's the work I'm here for. That's the work I do. Back in 1995, I was privileged to go over with a campaign group to Africa, and we did a 25-day mission trip in Zambia and Botswana. And we were out in the bush preaching in this place where people had walked for miles to gather to this place for preaching. The natives had built kind of a roughshod hut for probably about 400 people that we could have. And we were in the middle of nowhere, and I'm thinking, how many people are going to show up for this? Well, brethren, they came. And we'd preach in the morning, and we'd go down to this watering hole, and we'd baptize. We'd preach in the afternoon, and we'd go down to the watering hole again, and more people would be baptized. And then we'd preach at night by the light of a lantern. And more people would respond, and we'd go down to the watering hole. And at night, they had to go down there with some folks to shake around to make sure some of the wild animals were not sharing that watering hole with us. But we've been preaching all day long. We're coming back, and it's after dark, and these folks are singing as we're going back up the slope to where the assembly was. And one of the elders grabbed my arm and he said, "Do you know what those folks are singing?" I said, "I have no clue," because they're in their native language. And he said, "They're singing 'Keep on Preaching.'" And all the tiredness of the day just vanished from me right there. And brethren, that's the joy that we have. Peter tells us about our heavenly inheritance. We need to remember this all the time, but especially in times of trouble like those folks faced and which we face. And brethren, we just need to help other people to know they are included in this will that we're reading about each Lord's Day. In fact, maybe what you could do between now and Sunday, find a friend, find a neighbor, find somebody who has some interest in spiritual things, and tell them, guess what? You're in this will too. Why don't you come for the reading of the will? Brethren, thank you for your kind attention today. May the message of 1 Peter encourage you all your life, and may we all be encouraging others to come to the reading of the will. Thank you.
Father, thank you for the message tonight. Thank you for allowing us to be here. Father, we hope that something pricked our hearts, that there's something that we took from this lesson as we go closer to you. Be with us now as we leave this place, as we go home, that we remember to share you with others. It's in Jesus' name we pray.